We're so thrilled tonight to have Laura Hewitt and Herb Gstalder and Gary Kreamer with us, board members for the Wellfleet Natural Resource Advisory Board, and they're here to talk about the activities of the Natural Resource Advisory Board, as well as the newly formed Wellfleet Ponds Coalition, where Gary is a member of that board, as well as Herb and Laura. They're doing it all, and so they're just long-term committed community leaders and volunteers who really care about the health of the community, the natural resources, and the ponds. And so thanks for coming, and over to you.
Thank you, Krista, for having us to talk about Wellfleet waters. I'm Laura Hewitt. We thought we'd spend a few minutes today giving you an overview on the NRAB, as well as introduce the newly formed Friends of Wellfleet Ponds, and then also talk about the cyanobacteria testing program that APCC runs with Friends of Wellfleet Pond volunteers. The NRAB is an advisory board. We're tasked with doing the legwork for the select board on a number of natural resources topics. Probably the most two important ones that we are charged with are creating and updating a harbor management plan, as well as a pond management plan. And the harbor management plan was last updated in 2021, and the ponds were just finished last year in 2024. So what we learned on our journey of updating the pond management plan, it took us about 3 years. We had a little COVID slowdown, but we talked with other pond organizations on the Cape, various local governments, and we came away with a few key takeaways that we thought would be helpful as you hear the rest of this presentation to know. The first is that Wellfleet has some of the last pristine ponds on Cape Cod. That may not be news to you, but it's a huge asset for the town and a huge responsibility for Wellfleet. And the new news probably is that the town is going to need to take a little more active role in the oversight that the Cape Cod National Seashore has had for decades. Additionally, the Cape Cod National Seashore Park has been doing testing on the ponds since the 1980s. So they have a huge cache of data that's really, really valuable. We were, as the NRAB, quite dismayed to learn in January that their funding had been cut. So the NRAB went to the Wellfleet Select Board, asked for emergency funding, and were granted funding to help bridge the gap on a reduced protocol to get us through to April of 26. And APCC is going to do that in conjunction with some feedback from the park. What else we've learned from testing the waters? While the ponds may appear clear, there's been a lot of change going on over the last 30 or 40 years while the Seashore Park has been testing. If you look at the graph on the upper right-hand side, that is Great Pond in Wellfleet, and that is showing you the pH change over the last 30 years. The ponds were practically sterile in the 1970s. For people who remember swimming out and seeing a turtle 50 feet down, there was a reason why you could. So the acidity, and Gary's a water scientist, he can correct me if I'm wrong, but it has reduced 100%, right? 100-fold in that time period. So massive change in acidity to alkalinity, and with a much more alkaline water quality, it's much more hospitable to plant growth. Second graph down shows all ponds in the National Seashore Park from the fall, taken from early 80s through 2022. And that's showing, no surprise, temperatures have been getting hotter. But it also shows a 10 degree Fahrenheit increase over that period of time. 10 degrees is a lot for you and me. It's a whole lot more for a frog or a fish. So all of those together have changed the water quality. You add to that because the temperatures are warmer, there's a longer season, there's a lot more use. That is adding nutrient loading to the ponds in the form of both nitrogen and phosphorus. So with all of those together, it's creating a very hospitable environment for both algal growth and plants. And so as we looked at all of this, we thought, well, there's some things that we can control, and there's some things that we can't. So how do we move forward and control the ones that we can? So I'm going to turn it over to Herb Gstalder, who is the president of the Friends of Wellfleet Ponds, to talk about what they are doing and we are doing to try and keep the Wellfleet waters beautiful.
I'm Herb Gstalder, president of a very newly formed nonprofit 501c3 citizens organization, but we have deep roots. We grew out of the Gull Pond Area Conservation Association, GUPACA, that was established in 1983. It was clear to us that really there should be an organization looking over all the ponds. We saw that with the Cape Cod National Seashore that have been wonderful stewards of these ponds for many, many years. But they don't control their budget, and their budget disappeared this year. They would have not been able to continue the testing and monitoring of these ponds that date back to the 1980s. There is data on these ponds stretching that far back. And if you break the chain, you break the chain. So we are fortunate to be able to intervene 1 year. So what do? What's our purpose? Our purpose is to educate. We monitor the ponds. We do the cyanobacteria collection for the APCC. And we advocate. Our focus this year in advocating is to make sure that we will be able to continue to test the ponds. We're good, we're covered until spring of 2026, but not beyond that. So we want to ensure that the funds will be there to continue that. We've created a wonderful website. It's wellfleetponds.org. We have information on each pond. We have a lot of information on water quality and links to any number of resources. And I'd leave you with a plea to join us. Think of what you would like to do and become active in our organization as well. Thank you.
Now for the fear and loathing part of the program. These are the emotions that tend to arise when we talk about what's going on in our ponds and the health of our ponds, and particularly the cyanobacteria concerns that have arisen. Cyanobacteria are some of the longest lived organisms on the earth. They have adapted to living in all kinds of aquatic situations and habitats. They've adapted strategies to help them survive. They are able to adjust their buoyancy in the water column to take advantage of changing light and temperature and nutrient conditions, which tends to shift often the balance in their favor and outcompeting other phytoplankton. And some of the changes that humans have induced in the ponds also tip that balance in that direction. Already this season, there have been over 50 cyanobacteria alerts in our Cape Cod ponds, including one most recently in Eastham and Wellfleet. And those alerts are telling us that the trend is to see increasing frequency and intensity of these blooms as time goes on. Along the way, they also produce toxins. And the toxins that the cyanobacteria produce are very powerful and can cause various human and animal health risks. Cyanobacteria is not anything to be taken lightly. Monitoring of cyanobacteria has been going on thanks to APCC's efforts and a lot of volunteers for the past 5 years in Outer Cape ponds. And samples are collected biweekly and passed along to the labs at APCC and Barnstable Public Health, and results are reported back to town the next day, And any levels that are, there are 3 risk levels that are identified by the monitoring that's done, the testing that's done. And if there's a level of a high risk, the town will be posting those ponds to keep people from swimming in them and going into them. And the tests are then repeated within the next week to make sure that the conditions are better and the risk will not be lifted until the data shows that they are. The pond in the picture is actually Great Pond in Eastham near here, and this is what some cyanobacteria blooms look like. They're not all like this. They're often described as, like a pea soup or green paint on the surface, but they also cannot look like this. They cannot be as clearly visible. If you see a cyanobacteria, a scum of any kind, don't go near the water, don't touch it, but be sure to notify APCC and/or your town public health department to let them know.
Ongoing work that NRAB is involved with. So we're also equally committed to the harbor. And part of the recommendation in our 2021 plan was to produce an updated full harbor survey. The last one was done by the Mass Division of Fisheries in the 1960s. So we are well overdue. It was published in 1972. We've worked with Center for Coastal Studies, who has done some research to see what information we can leverage so that we can have the most efficient version of an updated harbor study. And they also presented what we had found out so far at the Wellfleet State of the Harbor meeting last fall. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. So we're excited now for White Gold, how oysters support estuarine health, aquaculture, and restoration. And we're joined tonight by Patrick Temple, who's the Coastal Restoration Project Manager with Cape Cod Conservation District. So when not out conducting fieldwork, Patrick's role as a Coastal Restoration Project Manager at the Cape Cod Conservation District entails coordinating with various municipal, state, and federal partners to optimally implement salt marsh restoration projects, primarily through means of tidal restriction removal. Patrick's prior experience includes extensive fieldwork, oyster aquaculture, data collection and management, and ecological restoration projects, specifically in Chesapeake Bay, oyster restoration efforts, riparian wetland plantings, regenerative agriculture, salt marsh survey work. This background of nature-based restoration and resilience projects informs his current work at the district. Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you, Krista. So Krista had initially asked me to come present on shellfish, and although I am an expert on eating shellfish, I let her know that if it was going to be on anything in particular and from a scientific perspective, it's going to have to be oysters, because that's where my background lies, that's where I have the most experience. So join me as we go over what oysters are doing, how they're doing, and how we can use them to support clean water restoration efforts in Mass and beyond. So a little background into the economics of aquaculture. It is the fastest growing agricultural category in the state of Mass. In 2023, it generated 30 million farm gate value. 95% of Massachusetts shellfish aquaculture production is oyster aquaculture specific. So it's really, really, really productive, really important to these local communities. It generates a lot of jobs, a lot of business, and a lot of tourism, as Chris and a lot of you all here are acutely aware. But it isn't just the economics of aquaculture and selling them to market that generates wealth for our communities. Oysters, while they're in the water, also produce a whole bunch of ecosystem services. So environmental economists get together and they run the data, and it ends up coming out to really amazing numbers between 5,000 and 100,000, depending on the siting of the oyster reef, per hectare per year, which is wild to think about the services that those oysters are providing before they even come out of the water for our communities. Some of the major ecosystem services, as you can see, are habitat provisioning, water filtration, shoreline stabilization, nitrogen cycling, and if you just break it down by category of ecosystem service, it's really, really amazing numbers that these organisms are providing. So that's me out on the boat, and I can speak to what I've seen firsthand. So you're out there, and that's an off-bottom cage, like a Virginia-style hotel cage that they'll place down, and there's oyster bags placed inside each of the slots. And you pull these up after they've been on bottom for sometimes 3 months untouched, sometimes less, depending on how frequently you're rotating the stock or needing to pull out oysters to sell to market. And you pull these bags up, and it is just a cornucopia of life that comes up with them. The bottom of the boat's covered with eels, mummy chugs. Sometimes you pull up a juvenile striper in with everything. And it really just goes to show that these small little rock-like animals that really are pretty unassuming and don't really tell the story as beautifully as some of our other marine organisms are amazing at providing a keystone role for benthic ecosystems and marine ecosystems. Something I have underlined here: a single adult oyster during the summer season, when they're most active filtering through the water column, can process 50 gallons of water a day, which, as that adds up, and historically, when reefs were prevalent, and we'll get to that in a bit, at historical numbers, would filter through entire estuaries in the span of days. And because their populations aren't where they used to be, that doesn't occur anymore. I also, before I move, I also want to talk about the wave attenuation that especially intertidal oyster reefs can provide. And you can see the number up there, but it can reduce wave energy by 76 to 99%. So really, really important for shoreline stabilization, for long-term coastal planning. If we can incorporate this into long-term O&M procedures for our coastlines, and especially in the riparian, the saltwater riparian zone, I think it could be remarkable. So enough good things. Now to get a little bit morbid, because all this good news can sometimes hide the reality of the situation. Yeah, 85% habitat loss globally. This is the most imperiled and threatened marine habitat on Earth. If you look at this map, the Massachusetts, if you zoom in real quick, is functionally extinct reef-wise, comparative to historical numbers, which you walk the flats, you go out and you hang out on Cape Cod, and you don't see that. You see some oysters here, there. You see little pockets of reefs. They used to be so prevalent they would sink ships. They were a navigational hazard in our embayments, and that's just not the case anymore. So reef extent has declined by 64% in the U.S., even more so prior to the 1800s. If we could go back, we just don't have that data. 88% decline in total biomass. So we're losing reefs, but we're losing oysters faster. So the reefs that are there are less productive. When you hear so much about mangrove salt marsh loss, coral reef loss, when you put it into context with oyster loss on a global scale, it pales. Also here, just to kind of get into the background of how oysters reproduce, it's spat and substrate. So the spat is the juvenile oyster once it's attached, so it attaches to any sort of like hard substrate. It needs a substrate to bind to in order to grow out its life cycle. New England and a lot of states up and down the eastern seaboard, because we've pulled so many oysters out of the water, are substrate limited as well. There's not enough hard surface in the water for them to be able to viably attach to, so that larvae just floats around until it dies. Can't find anything. Just a little look at the scale of loss. The mountains. The city of Cambridge, Maryland, is paved on oyster shells. Their streets, their current streets, you never know it going down there today, are essentially like some of the Gulf states. You've seen how they're building islands and like new land. That is what was done in the eastern shore of Maryland way back when. because they had a massive surplus of shell. And this is how the status of things went in the early 20th century, all up and down the eastern seaboard. So what threats are they seeing today? This is the Little Pamet system out in Truro. Shellfish area closed. Water quality is a big concern, as we all know, on Cape Cod. Has been for a while. It's looking like it will be for a while longer. A lot of these shellfish areas experience temporary closures, permanent closures, which, number one, the oysters aren't optimally functioning in these environments. And if they are there, they aren't able to provide those environmental and economic services that they otherwise would be able to provide for our communities. What are we doing about it? Well, thanks to Friends of Herring River and a lot of great environmental organizations across Mass, we're working to clean up our water. We're cleaning up our estuaries. We're removing tidal restrictions. My job at the Cape Cod Conservation District entails restoring 1,500 acres of salt marsh through tidal restriction removal. And one of the things that I've been getting into with my colleagues, because sometimes scientists they're very, very bad at pitching their work to the general public, and they're not always the most, they can't pitch across the aisle. So how do we pitch these projects and work with the government we have rather than the government we want? Because it's not always going to be, the people in charge aren't always going to be viewing our projects through the same lens that we are. And one of the exercises we had to go through with this current change of administration was repitching all of our projects of salt marsh restoration, habitat restoration, blue carbon to DOJ. And we sat down as a team and, what's the sell? And the sell is the same as it's always been. This is clean water. This is habitat for shellfish. This is habitat for finfish species. This is nursery habitat. And it brings economic value to the community. So just some of those things that we keep in mind as we're doing this work. And certainly any sort of shellfish-related benefit is seen as a net positive. And luckily, all our projects were reviewed by DOJ and A-OK'd. So it works. There are ways to pitch these projects across the aisle. So current status in Mass, 2023 was a huge year, mostly thanks to Governor Maura Healey, released Executive Order number 618, really targeting biodiversity in Mass and trying to improve imperiled ecosystems, including marine, coastal, and aquaculture. And what that led to was the development of Resilient Mass Plan, which led to a current project funded by NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is a subset of the United States Department of Agriculture. And this is a joint partnership between my organization, the Conservation District, Nature Conservancy, and DMF. And the long-term goal of this is to target habitat restoration in eelgrass, salt marsh, and oyster habitat across the state. So it's more so a pilot study, since the state of Mass is unfortunately lagging behind every other state on the East Coast when it comes to oyster restoration. There are no projects that the state has approved, undertaken. Everybody else is doing it because the data is there, the numbers are there. It works. It really, really works. And I've got a video to play later that is going over what's going on in the Chesapeake, and it's really remarkable, the larval recruitment and the strike that there's. So strike is the nomenclature for the spat set. The strike rates are through the roof in the estuaries where restoration has occurred. So a little rundown of this project. I'm not going to get into the specifics here, but just wanted to let you know that things are moving. Gears are turning. The state and DMF is coming around to this this topic that historically they have been very closed off towards. And where can it go? So this project between all of our partners is a 5-year plan, and we've got to think beyond it. Can this be scaled upwards? Can this go beyond oysters? Although I'm an expert at eating some of the other ones, as I said. Ribbed mussels have been shown to be the most effective filtering organisms in the intertidal in small grain-sized environments. So in those areas where you're mobilizing superfine sediments, ribbed mussels, blue mussels, 10 times better at filtering the sediments out of the water column than oysters. So depending on where you're siting these restoration efforts, it's important to keep other species in mind that might be more suitable. Again, you can't do restoration without monitoring. And I think we're all aware of that, and we got to make sure that we aren't putting anything in the water that is damaging what's already there. We don't want to make a bad situation worse. And the ideal finished project of everything is these are self-sustaining ecosystems that don't need touch-ups. They naturally can grow, accommodate towards sedimentation rates, and it presents a great opportunity to partner with communities, aquaculture practitioners, indigenous organizations, and those who might just recreationally use the resource. How can we get involved? How can we support bivalves? Really, I think the biggest thing is to remember that restoration of benthic habitat and bivalves isn't happening in a vacuum. There's lots of things that we can do to support those efforts: clean water initiatives, restoring tidal flow to our estuaries, decreasing fertilizer runoff, decreasing our septic issues that we have really prevalent across Cape, improving sewering. It's a multi-pronged approach, decreasing coastal development that increases erosional rate and can smother our habitat. It's a multi-pronged approach that you can't do anything in isolation. Everything, it has to be work in conjunction with each other, and we have to speak to each other. As I said, New England is very substrate limited. Mass Oyster Project is one of the few organizations that is really, the individual towns do a really great job, and the shellfish departments do a really amazing job of seeding their own beds and recycling shell. But from a scalable perspective, along the state, Mass Oyster Project is one of the few organizations that is taking a leadership role there. If you can work with restaurants that you eat at to make sure that they're recycling shell, talk to your shellfish departments, make sure that they're supporting their benthic habitat and recycling shell where appropriate. Because if this is going to be something that the state, the municipalities look to expand, substrate is going to be a limiting factor. The price of substrate and oyster shell has just gone through the roof. It was 10 cents a bushel back in 1970, and it's somewhere around like $7 a bushel today. So it's only getting more expensive, and if we can get it for free, why not? And then stay informed. Really do as much as you can to keep oysters and other bivalves at the front of your brain. When you go out to a restaurant, make sure that they're getting harvested sustainably. And if you want to learn more, I'm happy to chat and point you in any direction.
So we are at our third presentation, and we're really excited to have Dr. Hilary Sullivan here with us. So this is Agriculture in Salt Marshes, Historic Activity and Modern Day Impacts. So Hilary has worked as a scientist researching the ecology of salt marshes for over 10 years. And prior to joining Friends of Herring River, yay, she worked at Woodwell Climate Research Center researching human impacts in salt marshes. She earned her PhD in marine science from Northeastern University with a focus on hydraulic restoration in salt marshes. She's passionate about preserving natural spaces and their ecosystem services in the face of climate change.
So I'll bet you all didn't know that every salt marsh used to be a farm. So I'm going to round out tonight's water-themed talks discussing our current knowledge on how historically humans have altered salt marsh hydrology for agricultural practices and how we're using that knowledge to inform hydrologic restoration. But first, briefly, and I'm sure all of you know what salt marshes are and why they're important, but these are really critical ecosystems that are at the interface between the land and the sea. And they're very dynamic ecosystems, but they're also can be very harsh environments because they experience drastic fluctuations in salinity, temperature, as well as moisture because they're extremely tidally influenced. And they're dominated by a few species of grasses, as you can see pictured here, and they really these grasses form the backbone and the structure of the salt marsh ecosystem. These ecosystems provide a number of important services. We talked about all the ecosystem services that oysters provide. Marshes provide nursery grounds and habitat for many different organisms. They also protect our coastlines by buffering against storms and protecting against erosion. They retain and recycle nutrients, primarily nitrogen, and then they also store large amounts of carbon. This figure highlights the fact that salt marshes store more carbon per hectare than tropical and boreal forests. And they store this carbon in their above ground vegetation as well as in their below ground sediments. And the reason they can store so much carbon is because they are very, very wet environments with low oxygen, and that allows for slow rates of decomposition. And this is really going to be important when we're thinking about water movement and hydrology. Hydrologic influxes to salt marshes include tidal regime, rainfall and storms, as well as groundwater, so trickle and primarily freshwater inputs from upland systems. Combined with the unique topography of the marsh, so the elevation, the shape of the channel, as well as the sediment type, so that's going to influence the permeability of the marsh. If we combine all of these different factors, these factors influence those ecosystem services that I just talked about, including plant zonation, sediment deposition, as well as nitrogen cycling. Marshes experience 2 high tides and 2 low tides per day, but they also experience tides of different stages. So the neap tides are our lowest of the low, so these are based off the lunar cycle. And you can see the difference between the neap tides and our mid tides, and even spring and king tides are much higher. And I like this picture because it really highlights just how influential the water movement is at connecting different parts of the ecosystem. So you can imagine that on those high tides, parts of the marsh that aren't previously connected will be, and that influences things like nutrient cycling and especially connecting parts of the food web. So as I mentioned, every marsh was a farm. This is a depiction of how we envisioned some of the alterations to the habitat in order to successfully farm. So you can see farmers digging up the grasses and the peat to build an embankment over that structure in the middle is a water control structure, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And they built these embankments and these water control structures to manipulate the water in order to either dry the sediment or keep pools of water on the marsh. Marshes, this is a map from the 1790s, and I like this map because it really shows how the farmers divvied up property boundaries in order to use the resources of the marsh. And essential features that they wanted when they divvying up these property boundaries were space for a house, a place for fishing, access to salt hay, and then access to upland resources. And so I know today when I think about marshes, we don't really think about them being privately owned or divvied up like this. And so it's really interesting how farmers used to own different parts of the land and use them for their personal needs. Evidence of farming began as early as the 1630s. Obviously, this is a more recent picture, but the primary practices that they used were they watered their cattle, they grew crops, and then most importantly, they harvested this salt marsh hay. And they would put the hay on staddles in this picture here and allowed it to dry. And that hay would be used to feed cattle as well as use in furniture and things like that. And what's really interesting is that these staddles you can see remnants of them in many, many marshes today, primarily in the Northeast. You can see them just when you're out walking or doing research. So to be successful at farming and tying it into water, the farmers learned how to manipulate the salt marsh hydrology to cultivate the land and create conditions and soil saturation conditions that were favorable for their needs. So this is I apologize, it's a little small, but this is actually pretty famous kind of how-to diagram of how to alter the hydrology in order to dry the sediment. And so on the top left, that's what's called a trunk. This is a water control structure which farmers used to control the water level using the rod and valve on the bottom right of the screen. And they built these water control structures into embankments, as you can see highlighted here. And I know it's probably difficult to see, but there's a dotted line that just shows how to divert the water away to create these dry conditions. And you can actually also still see remnants of these trunk infrastructure throughout marshes today, which is pretty impressive. In addition to the trunks, farmers also dug ditches. And so ditches were used twofold, to both drain standing water and then also to collect sediment that was used for embankments. And we'll talk about embankments in a second. So farmers dug ditches, but then additionally, mosquito control in the 1930s, there was widespread installation of these ditches to control for mosquito populations. And so you can see just how successful these channels are at draining standing water off the marsh. However, once these ditches were abandoned, they used to be maintained and cleaned out. Once these ditches were abandoned, they have been becoming clogged, and that's what's going to be disrupting our natural tidal hydrology, and we'll see that later on. Lastly, there was a large embankment system installed to help with farming. And again, those borrow ditches that I talked about on the right of each embankment was used for the sediment that they placed to make these embankments. And the goal of the embankments was to essentially create these terraced systems so that they could dry the sediment in order to grow crops. Embankments are probably the most prominent feature that remains from our agricultural history, and they're very visible with the naked eye, as you can see here. The terrace system would get fresher as you moved upland, and that's where they would grow their more prized crops. And here's another example of remnants of an embankment today, where you have higher and drier soils up on that embankment and a different vegetation type than the saturated soils in the center of the embankment. You can imagine there might be issues with this as well. So while it's great at keeping the water off, on those really, really high tides, the water does or can flood over the embankment, and it gets trapped in that sediment. The main crop that farmers grew was a mangel wurzel. I still can't even say it, but it's basically a beet. And this beet was grown to primarily feed livestock. And so digging all these ditches and embankments helped freshen hay beds for the farmers to grow crops. And this increased their yield 3 to 4 times, allowing them to move from subsistence farming to being able to market their excess crops. So this is great. This is a really awesome method of manipulating hydrology, being able to utilize the land to benefit their purposes. But at what cost? And sorry to be dramatic, but we're seeing a lot of current influence of this historic agriculture that farmers didn't think, 4 centuries later would happen. So beyond seeing a ton of remnants of their activity, you can see a remnant of a staddle, some land bridges, property boundaries with the rocks. We're also seeing the emergence of megapools. So researchers have coined the megapools, categorized them essentially, related to different land uses. So the most predominant and most common type of megapool we see are these ones called waffle maple syrup. And they're called that, and you'll see another example because they do. They look like waffles with maple syrup. And these are found in areas that have high density of ditches and embankments, right? So again, that's trapping that water and causing the pools to form. Amorphous pools are more ubiquitous in marshes with no ditching, and they're more caused by sea level rise or some sort of other disturbance that has caused vegetation loss. And then jigsaw puzzle pools are found up towards the upland, and they're driven, we think, by more freshwater groundwater sources. So if we think about the waffle maple syrup pools and how they form, what I'm showing here is we have the vegetated embankments in the blue, and then on either side are ditches. And so the ditches lower the water table, right, because they're drawing the water out of the marsh area. The marsh surface then becomes oxidized, so oxygen is introduced, and that causes the peat to decompose, and the marsh subsides and we lose elevation. So you're basically getting a kind of sinking of elevation within the middle of those ditched embankments, and it's causing the water to continue to be pooled and trapped, and that's expanding. Here's just another great example of pictures of what some of these embankments have done and are causing today, especially in our northeast marshes. We're seeing this incredible emergence of these interior areas of shallow standing water. Just to bring it more locally, here's a nice figure of the Barnstable Great Marshes, and the green lines are all the ditches in that marsh. So this is a really heavily ditched area. Primarily, we think these are mosquito ditches just based off the linearity of them. There's not a lot of the cross-hatching and not as many embankments that we can identify. And here's just that same view more without the green lines. So you can really even aerially see just how heavily ditched just this one marsh is here on Cape Cod. Researchers believed that we used to be in this ideal dynamic equilibrium. So if you have a formation of a pond, the pond would naturally recover, and then we would have no net marsh loss. And it would recover by eventually the pool would increase in size enough to reach a drainage feature where it would naturally drain, revegetate, and grow back into a healthy marsh. This depends on sea level rise, sediment supply, which is really important for elevation gain, historic human impacts, so all those farming practices we've been discussing, as well as elevation. And so unfortunately, we are no longer in this dynamic equilibrium. Flooding stress and vegetation death is causing the peat to collapse, and we're losing valuable salt marsh habitat. And what I do want to point out is our global rates of sea level rise are still lower than the marsh drowning threshold. So right now, many marshes are able to keep pace with sea level rise, but we are seeing a prevalence of that pool deepening, the loss of elevation, and persistence of standing water. And this loss of that dynamic equilibrium is an important mechanism for marsh loss. And when we lose this habitat, we're going to be losing all of these important ecosystem services that we discussed that the marsh provides. And so, introducing the need for hydrologic restoration. How can we help the marsh restore its natural tidal flow in order to revegetate, recolonize, and continue providing those ecosystem services that we rely on? In addition to thin layer deposition, there's two other methods that we're using in Massachusetts. The first is ditch remediation. If you look at the top, the left figure shows ditches that have been remediated. So we basically fill them in with sediment and marsh grasses, and they kind of naturally close. And the idea here is to stop that subsidence, that oxidation, and to allow the marsh to the tidal water to flow naturally. And you can see on the right what happens when these ditches are left untreated. They often continue to just expand and grow and become oxidized. And secondly, we can use a technique called runneling. Runneling is the installation of these small narrow channels into the marsh surface. They're very, very shallow and very, very narrow. And we connect them to a mega pool or an area of standing water to a drainage feature. And the idea here is to facilitate drainage of that area to increase vegetation and increase elevation gain. And what I want to point out is the size of that runnel compared to ditches and the tidal channel, they're very, very small, minimally impacting the marsh surface. So I've just told you two different conflicting restoration techniques, right? Close the ditches and dig a smaller ditch. And that's because restoration is really complicated and really site-specific. And so we really, when we think about how we're restoring hydrology to these systems, we take a very comprehensive, holistic approach. This is a suggestion of a restoration in a marsh up in Ipswich, Massachusetts. And these researchers suggest to install runnels, so the light blue line, that drain into open ditches, the dark blue line, and then they're going to close the ditches that are in orange. So you can see they're thinking about ways that the water is naturally flowing and the best way to kind of force the water to where they think will best heal that lost marsh habitat. And so as you're comprehensively restoring this hydrology, the goal is to really recover that elevation and allow the marsh grasses to grow and keep pace with sea level rise. And sometimes that also involves addressing other anthropogenic features. So that can be removing those water control structures if there's, let's say, trunks or bridges left in the marsh. That could also be cutting through embankments or berms. And I want to just briefly zoom in on a case study. This is Doghead Marsh, a project I've been working on down in Falmouth at the Wakwepe National Estuarine Research Reserve. And Doghead Marsh is, if you follow the arrow, over the past 20 years, it's been experiencing an immense amount of pool expansion and vegetation loss. And so we chose 5 pools to remediate with runnels, and then we did some selective ditch maintenance, just cleaning some of the clogged ditches out to allow for a better flow path of that water off the marsh. And so in 2023, we installed these runnels. Here's a picture of one of our pools before the runnel was installed, and then just about 6 months later, that picture is after the runnel was installed. So you can see it's already significantly dropping the water level and clearing that sediment, hopefully allowing the vegetation to recolonize. And if you are interested in the data, before the runnel was installed, the low water level in that pool was about 12 centimeters. So there was pretty consistently about 12 centimeters of water just sitting in that pool. And the runnel reduced that standing water by about 66%. So in just, about 7 months, the water dropped to about 4.3 centimeters, which allowed the vegetation to recover by about 13%. We're looking at a figure showing the difference in vegetation percent cover before and after runneling. And you can see that yellow bar are our runneled plots. The vegetation is coming back, compared to just a reference marsh that didn't receive runnels, and then pools that obviously also were just control. And so I want to just end by highlighting the fact that restoration is a difficult process, right? It really takes an understanding of the site-specific tidal flows, hydrology, elevation, historic impacts are now really being included in restoration plans. But, taking in a more holistic view and understanding is going to help inform the best strategies for restoring these habitats.